All right, let's jump right into this. What we're doing today is breaking down a really provocative thesis by an author named Rajiv Srinivasan. He's asking a pretty startling question. Is the Hindu American community facing a kind of crisis that could actually lead to an exodus from the United States? Now, that's a heavy topic, so let's unpack the arguments he's laying out. So, the author doesn't start with data or statistics. He kicks things off with this incredibly graphic and disturbing story out of Dallas, Texas. He goes into detail about how this man, Chandramouli Nagamalia, was killed in front of his family over a fight about a washing machine. It's just a horrific event, and the author uses it as the launching point for a much, much bigger claim.
And that brings us to the core question of this whole piece, right? How do you connect one man's brutal murder to the potential future of an entire community of, 2 or 3 million people? Let's take a look at the argument he builds to connect those dots.
The author frames his entire thesis not as a surefire prediction, but as this, a chilling question. He's suggesting that there's a kind of perfect storm brewing, a mix of factors creating a hostile environment that could, in his view, eventually force Hindu Americans to leave the country they've made their home.
Okay, so the first pillar of his argument is all about physical safety. He contends that there's a growing climate of fear, and it's being fueled by violent crime that's making the community feel more and more vulnerable.
To back this up, he points to this number, 633. He says that's how many Indian students have died abroad in just the last 5 years. And he specifically highlights that a big chunk of those were in the West, with 108 of those deaths happening right here in the U.S. And it's not just that one opening story. The author lists other violent incidents to suggest this is part of a broader pattern of brutality. It's interesting, he's not saying all the victims are Hindu American. Instead, he includes them to paint this picture of what he sees as a general rise in really extreme violence. He even adds the unexplained death of the OpenAI whistleblower, Suchir Balaji, to his list of events that are cause for concern. So here's a crucial point. Why the laser focus on Hindu Americans specifically? Well, according to the author, other groups from India, like Muslims and Christians, have these existing religious networks they can plug into for support. He argues that Hindu Americans don't really have a comparable safety net, and that makes them feel uniquely isolated and vulnerable.
All right, let's move on to the second pillar of this argument. This part isn't about physical violence. It's about what the author calls a war of narrative, and it's focused specifically on the issue of caste discrimination.
The author lays out this timeline of events that he presents as basically a coordinated campaign. He points to California's SB 403 bill, which ended up being vetoed. Then came the big lawsuits against the tech company Cisco and the huge Babs Temple in New Jersey, both alleging caste bias. And then he points to a new bill, SB 509, which he also claims is targeting the community.
Now, this slide gets to the author's real point about this whole narrative thing. He's quick to highlight that in the Cisco case, the claims against the managers were actually withdrawn. And in the Babs Temple case, federal prosecutors closed their investigation and found no violations. But, and this is his key point, he argues the damage was already done. In his view, the public story had been successfully turned against the community, no matter what the courts decided.
This leads us to the third part of his argument, and it's a bit of a paradox. The author is basically suggesting that the very success of the Hindu American community has, ironically, made it a target. The thesis here is that this whole model minority label has a really dangerous downside. He argues that the community's high income and success doesn't always get you admiration. Instead, it can stir up economic envy and make people look for scapegoats, especially when the rest of the economy isn't doing so great.
And for a concrete example of this, he points directly at the attacks on the H-1B visa program, which, as you know, has been a huge pathway for professionals from India. He specifically brings up a proposal from the Trump administration for a massive, what he calls, tax on these visas as proof of this backlash driven by economic envy.
So, just to recap, we've got arguments based on violence, narrative, and envy. This fourth and final pillar is the one that ties them all together: a perceived lack of political power.
The author uses this classic guns versus butter analogy to explain what he means. He argues that for centuries, Hindus have been focused on creating wealth, that's the butter, but they've neglected building political power, the guns. And the historical lesson, he says, is that if you don't have the guns, someone else is eventually going to come and take your butter. To show how this plays out today, he brings it right back to the murder of Chandra Nagamalia that we started with. He claims that prominent Hindu politicians, he names Vivek Ramaswamy, were pretty much silent about the killing until they got pushed by critics online.
He sees this as a sign of reluctance to really wield political power for the community.
He then draws his comparison. In his view, Hindu Americans are so focused on material success that they drop the ball on political power. He contrasts this with what he sees as the growing political influence of other groups, pointing to the All-Muslim City Council in Hamtramck, Michigan, and the powerful jobs held by people of Pakistani origin over in the UK.
So, what happens when you put all of these pressures together? Well, the author brings these 4 arguments to a head to issue a really stark and, frankly, deeply unsettling warning.
He argues that the combined weight of everything, physical danger, a hostile narrative, economic envy, and political weakness, could create a situation that's just not sustainable anymore, potentially forcing a mass departure of Hindu Americans from the United States.
And to make sure everyone understands the seriousness of his warning, he draws this incredibly powerful and controversial historical parallel. He compares a potential future exodus from the U.S. to the forced expulsion of Indians from Uganda back in the 1970s.
But the author doesn't just end on a warning. He actually offers a call to action aimed at India. He argues that India needs to get ready to become the nation of last resort, creating programs to welcome back its diaspora and, as he puts it, turn a potential trauma for those individuals into a big economic win for the country by using their talent.
And so, that's where we're left. The author's laid out his case, built on these 4 distinct pillars, arguing for a potential crisis. It's a thesis that is clearly designed to provoke a lot of thought and debate about the pressures facing a really prominent community and what the future might actually hold.